Our third speaker is Dr. Katie Hirsch, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Kinesiology. Her area of expertise is sport and exercise psychology with specific research interests in sport leadership, group dynamics, and body image. Dr. Hirsch earned a bachelor's degree of science in psychology and sociology from Furman University, and both a master of human kinetics with a concentration in sports psychology and a PhD in kinesiology from the University of Windsor. Her project is focused on exploring what type of leadership university athletes and coaches want from the athletes on their teams. Please welcome Dr. Katie Hirsch.
Hi, everyone, and thank you all for sticking around for my presentation. I'm really excited to be sharing what I've been working on within my Emerging Scholars Grant. And so, like Dr. Hout mentioned, I'm very interested in group dynamics and essentially trying to find different ways that we can optimize group functioning on sport teams. And the main way that I approach understanding that is by looking at the leaders on teams and how we can optimize leadership behaviors from coaches, but more specifically athlete leaders within my line of research. And so when we're talking about leadership, we're mostly talking about influence and how one person can influence at least two other people on their team, ideally towards a positive common goal. And when we think about sport teams and the leaders on sport teams, we commonly think of coaches, but the athletes on the team also provide key leadership behaviors to their teammates as well. And how coaches and athlete leaders work together is really important for understanding how teams can be successful from a performance standpoint, but also from interacting with each other and creating positive sport experiences for people. And so, as I mentioned, I am really focused on athlete leaders in most of my research. And when we're thinking about athlete leaders, it's not just the captains on the team, but anyone who's an athlete has the potential to fulfill a leadership role. And we typically distinguish different types of athlete leaders as either formal athlete leaders or informal athlete leaders, with the key distinction being the title or having no title. And so formal athlete leaders are athletes who do have that title. It can either be assigned by the coach, or they could be elected by the coaching staff or by their teammates, or they could even serve in a leadership group, like maybe they are a representative for their academic year on a certain leadership group. And so these are commonly things like our captains or assistant captains. But equally important are these informal athlete leaders who are still providing leadership. They're still influencing their teammates, but they don't have this title. We commonly think of veteran teammates, so older teammates, they've been on the team for longer, they know more about how the team functions, how it maybe should function. But it can also be people who throw the parties, the social leaders, people who are on the bench motivating players, even though they might not get a lot of playing time themselves. There are a variety of potential ways that informal athlete leaders can present themselves on teams. And as I mentioned, their role is equally as important as our formal athlete leaders. In fact, research shows that when we're looking at certain leadership behaviors, when athletes are asked to identify who is primarily providing that, there are a large number of athletes who are saying it's actually someone who is not the captain, or it is not someone who is the formal leader. And that's perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with that. It's very unfair to expect one individual like a captain to fulfill all of the needs of the team for an athlete leadership position. So these informal leaders are really critical. In addition, you can see a pie chart here that depicts the ideal breakdown of a team in terms of how much of the team should be formal athlete leaders versus informal athlete leaders, and then athletes who do not occupy a leadership position. And so what researchers have found from this is that about 2/3 of the team should be fulfilling roles of informal athlete leadership, with an additional about 15 to 16% as formal athlete leaders, with the remainder not occupying any sort of leadership position. And so this further demonstrates why informal leadership, in addition to formal athlete leadership, is so important for understanding. And currently, Most of the research on athlete leadership has looked at these captains or has looked at other formal athlete leaders, in part because it's easier to identify them. They do have this status, they do have this label on them. But more and more research is starting to look at informal leadership, and I'm interested in looking at both. And so, one thing that's really important for an athlete leader, or really any leader in any field, is to understand the needs of their followers. What do their followers want from them? And so, in previous research that I've conducted, I've looked at coaches in comparison to athlete leaders and what their athletes want from both of them. So, what do I want my coach to be doing? And then also, what do I want my athlete leaders to be doing? And these were the findings shown here, with almost all of the behaviors being preferred at higher rates for coaches instead of the athlete leaders, which makes sense. Our coaches at this level were hired for their position, and they have that responsibility of providing leadership. But you'll also note that even though athlete leaders were preferred less often, there are still relatively high amounts of the amount or the occurrence that these behaviors should be exhibited by athlete leaders. So the athlete leaders do play a key role. One of the limitations of this research is that we looked at formal and informal together. We didn't ask specifically informal or specifically formal what they would want. And so that's one of the key gaps that I'm addressing in my research that I'm conducting within the Emerging Scholars Grant. And so, as I mentioned, few research has looked at informal, but also in especially little research has looked at informal in comparison to formal athlete leaders. And as I mentioned at the very beginning, how our leaders are sharing responsibilities is really important. And so if we can look at both types together, we can have a better understanding of those ideas. In addition, most of the research that's looked at leadership has primarily focused on athletes' perspectives, as opposed to what coaches want from their athlete leaders. In particular, what coaches want from informal athlete leaders has not been explored as much. And so, one of the major goals that we're hoping to get out of this research is to understand different types of athletes' perspectives, as well as coaches' perspectives of what they want from informal athlete leaders and formal athlete leaders. And so we are exploring the university context, athletes and coaches across two different stages or phases, rather, trying to accomplish two key purposes. The first is to compare the frequency that athletes want their formal athlete leaders and their informal athlete leaders to provide certain behaviors. And then from that, we will analyze that data, and that will inform the types of questions that we're going to ask athletes and coaches to dive a little bit deeper on why there might be differences or why there might be similarities in what is preferred in these two different types of leaders. And so here's a bit more information on those two phases. The research design is an explanatory sequential mixed method design, so quantitative followed by qualitative. And so the first phase is a survey design where university athletes complete two different inventories. Two of them focused on the formal athlete leaders, then they complete the exact same inventories in reference to their informal athlete leaders. And again, this is going to give us the occurrence, how often they want these behaviors to be exhibited, not much at all about the how or the why, just how much. And then in the second phase, the qualitative portion, we'll get to learn even more about maybe why those differences or similarities are being presented through using focus group interviews. And so these are the two inventories that I mentioned. We're using the leadership scale for sports, as well as the differentiated transformational leadership inventory, the preferred version. So they're asked, how often do you want your leaders to be doing these things? And they rate it on a scale of never or not at all to always or all the time, depending on which inventory it is. And so there we're able to quantify those scores. And currently, we have 124 participants in our study. And here is a brief look at the data. We will be conducting a repeated measures ANOVA, but I haven't done that yet, just simply looking at the means here based off of what we had as of this week. And so just to the naked eye, it doesn't seem like there are any drastic differences in what our current participants are wanting from their formal athlete leaders versus their informal athlete leaders. And that is equally as interesting and important as if there were significant differences, because this can show that while some people might value formal leaders more, and that might be more of a norm within sport, this is indicating that if this were to maintain as the final findings, that informal athlete leadership is really critical as well. In addition to comparing formal and informal athlete leaders, we're also going to be comparing between behaviors, and that will give us information on what behaviors both types of leaders should prioritize providing. And so once we complete the data collection and analysis of that, like I mentioned, that will inform what questions we want to ask in focus group interviews. And the focus groups will be 2 focus groups with athletes only, and then 2 that have coaches only. That's mostly so that athletes feel comfortable speaking about things without their coaches present, and so that they can bounce their ideas off of more potentially like-minded or peers of them. And again, this is going to help us dive deeper into the how and the why of some of those findings from phase 1. And so some key implications of this are that we're going to be able to educate athletes, coaches, as well as mental performance consultants so that we can then prioritize the correct behaviors and also reflect how formal athlete leaders can work better with informal athlete leaders and vice versa to optimize that shared leadership, which will then hopefully give several benefits like team cohesion, athlete satisfaction, and then also performance. In addition, one of those inventories that we're using was originally created for the coaching context. And so if we can see that these behaviors are also preferred for athlete leaders, that might give some additional support for the utility of that inventory with athlete leaders. I would like to wrap up by thanking several people, not only the College of HEST for providing funding for this project, but also the athletics department at NMSU has been really critical to helping me conduct this research, get connected with teams, connected with athletes. And if any of you all know any university athletes, that would be awesome if you could connect me with them, because I'm looking for about 70 more participants for this first phase. And then I would also like to highlight an undergraduate student who's been working with me, Natalie Martinez. She has been awesome, helping out with data collection, cleaning the data, really hardworking, awesome student who comes from psych, but is minoring in like 3 other things, one of them being kinesiology. So really happy to have her on board, and she presented some of this work at IRCAS last week. And if any of you want to share the survey link, the QR code is there. So with that, thank you all for listening.
Do you use leadership, like the word specifically all the time? I feel like maybe there are some people who are receiving what you would call leadership, but they might call it that.
That's a really interesting point. I was actually speaking with a coach earlier today, and because for some teams, I can kind of break this data down for their team specifically. And with this team, I showed you all the breakdown of the pie chart, and over half the team did not identify as leaders. And the coach was like, but that's a problem, which it is a problem. But I think some of these leaders actually are providing leadership. They just don't realize it. And so one of the ways that I try to mitigate that issue when collecting data, at least in this sort of example, is providing definitions and examples of leadership before they get into the surveys. And so that helps, but that is certainly a limitation with not only the research, but also athletes being leaders on their team, is just simply not understanding how many possible things leadership can be. And so that is something to consider. However, I do typically use leadership as the term.
I have two questions. The first one is when you say formal leadership, you're talking about the coaches and like the captains?
In this context,
Yes.
only the captains or athletes who have been assigned leaders. In this specific study, we were not asking, and we will not be asking, what coaches should be doing.
Okay, I was wondering that because like power dynamics might have been different, so thank you for the clarification. And my second question is, for the initial one that you showed us, it looked like the autocratic behavior was slightly higher for informal leaders, and I was just wondering what you might think about that.
For the preliminary data
No,
or
for
with the
the-
coaches?
That had
Okay. Yes. So, yes, we have really tried to make sense of this because you're talking about power dynamics earlier in your first question, and autocratic behavior can have elements of a stronger, more divided power dynamic, but it can also just be an acceptance of authority and independence in the individual. One of the potential explanations that we've come up with for this is that the coach has so much power, like things over playing time, and that playing time can be so valuable to athletes that autocratic behavior can sometimes be more intimidating or more powerful than if an athlete leader did it. And so an athlete leader can do it and it might not be as potentially negatively impactful. So that's one of the reasons, but yeah, that one's been a doozy for us to wrap our minds around. Yeah.
Thank you.
What about the role in gender? When you're looking at leadership in the playing time with that, so what, are you looking at gender in any of these?
Oh,
studies?
gender. We have not yet been looking at gender in our previous research. We had a bit of an imbalance in the findings that we're looking at here, and so we didn't, but I'm hopeful right now. We tend to be imbalanced with more women participating than men. But if we can get more men, I would love to look at that. There are some in previous research that have found different things like social support as something that women tend to prefer more from their teammates, so their athlete leaders, than men. However, hopefully that can be, while it's not the purpose, something that we could also add to see if there are differences in preferred frequency of behaviors.
Anything else?
Thank you.
Thanks.